When I got my rocker mini lathe, my wife suggested I turn something called a yarn bowl. Then I found out she already had a ceramic version. And that put the yarn bowl at the top of my project list. And there's nothing real complicated about a yarn bowl. It is just a bowl that yarn fits into. In addition to just sizing, there is one design feature that we have to pay attention to. Roughly the top third of the bowl has a slight taper inwards, and that helps keep the yarn ball inside the bowl rather than let it climb out. So I kept that ceramic thing around as a reference and found myself a chunk of ambrosia maple. The first step is to locate and mark the center of the workpiece. I'm going to use the woodworm screw in my one-way Talon chuck, so our next step is to go to the drill press. I need a 9mm hole 3/4 of an inch deep as a pilot for the woodworm screw. Then after installing the woodworm screw into the Talon chuck, I was ready to mount the wood and get ready for turning. Even though this is a pretty small hunk of wood, it's still safer to bring the tailstock up and use that to support the back of the blank during the initial rounding. I suppose I could have knocked the corners off of this blank at the bandsaw, but it's pretty small for that, and it's a soft wood, so I can turn through the corners pretty quickly. We need to be very careful when we're doing this, and be sure to wear a mask because you get a lot of chips flying around. I had to stop frequently to readjust my tool rest. We don't want to get too much of this tool hanging over the tool rest, even if we are just breaking corners, because it gets very hard to control and it's a lot more dangerous that way. And as we remove some of the corners, we're making clearance for the banjo underneath it so I can reach farther over across the piece to get the whole thing round. And from here I just keep repeating that process until we get the whole thing rounded out. There's just no way to rush this process and stay safe, so take your time and do it right. The piece is much closer to round now, and I can start taking cleaner cuts and even begin working some of the shape into it. I'm still taking light cuts, and I stop frequently to move the tool rest a little closer to the piece. When I get the piece rounded out, I'd like to make a pass across its face, routing the bevel to get a smoother surface. I guess this isn't really necessary at this point, but it just makes me feel better about what I'm doing and gives me a basis to start creating the shape. The bottom of this piece is way out of line, and I need to true this up because one of the shapes is going to run right into the bottom edge of the bowl. Just use a scraper with light cuts until we get it flattened out. Here I'm beginning to work that rounded shape into the outside of the bowl. I want to have a bead at the top and the bottom, so I have to keep that in mind while I'm cutting this shape. It's easy to forget a detail like that and force yourself into making a bowl that's a different shape than you wanted. This is a pretty large roughing gouge, but I can start the shape with this and give myself something to work with later on with a spindle gouge. This is another part of that thinking ahead thing that it took me a little while to figure out when I started turning. Now I've changed to a 3/8 inch spindle gouge. I know that it actually looks too small for the job, but once you get used to using it, you can get a lot of detail out of a tool like this safely on bowls. I learned to just take my time and watch how I'm presenting the tool to the wood. That way you avoid catches. To get a clean line between the bead and the body of the bowl, we have to work this from both sides. This is easier to produce a nice clean line when you remove a little bit of wood from either side. And here's the basic shape at the bottom of the bowl. After I establish the bead at the top of the bowl, we'll true up the center of it and get a nice rounded shape there. I just want to get the basic shape around the center of the bowl. Then when we start sanding it, all little shapes will come right in and blend into each other. I've already laid out the diameter of the recess that I want to cut so we can turn this around on the chuck. Now I'll use my regular 1/4 inch parting tool to cut the recess out, making sure that the outside edges of the recess have a slight dovetail shape to them. I only need to angle the parting tool a little bit to get that taper in the recess that'll help the jaws hang on tightly. This is an important step that a lot of people miss. I'm not just flattening this base out, I'm tapering the edge so it goes in towards the center. I want the bowl to be standing on just the outer edge of the bottom surface. With the bowl standing on just the edges of the bottom, it can bridge little imperfections and stay stable on a table where others might rock. Now with the piece turned around, I can start removing the material from inside of the bowl. I generally use a bunch of different tools while I'm doing this. I'll start with a scraper to get the surface nice and flat, and then I'll often go to my favorite half-inch traditional bowl gouge. For me, this is an easier tool to use than the fingernail type gouges, and I can remove a lot of material quickly with this. And before you know it, I'm getting deep enough that I have to pay attention about how deep I'm actually going so I don't break through the bottom. We have to remember that 3/8 inch deep recess that we cut in the bottom. We want to make sure we don't go that far down. And finally, I've changed my round scraper from Easy Wood Tools because this is an easy tool to control and I can make nice clean surfaces. Part of this process is smoothing the bottom and the sides. And remember that we want the top part of this to angle in a little bit. I find that it's easier for me to do these processes with this scraper, but you can use whatever tool you feel comfortable with. With all the turning done, we can move on to sanding. No matter how you're going to finish your bowl, sanding is always very important to how good that finish comes out. I'm a big fan of buffing wood, so I'm going to buff this bowl rather than apply a liquid finish to it. I know some guys think that you're cheating when you're buffing, that you don't have to sand as much, but you actually have to sand more. Here I'm down to 320 grit paper, and I use worn out pieces to finish out the sanding. Whenever you're sanding at the lathe, make sure that you hold the paper between your fingers. Don't wrap it around the finger. Whether you're working inside or outside, we want the paper to be able to just pull out from between your fingers if it catches on the piece. And it doesn't matter if we're sanding inside or outside. We always hold the paper between the fingers. I use the Beal buffing system on my mini lathe. Here I have the ball style buffers for working the inside of the bowl. And just as with the larger wheels, there's 3 of these balls that we go through to get the surface that we want. It's about 20 minutes later, and this is the final buffing ball for the inside. One of the things I like about this is when I'm done. There's no drying. This is ready to use. I've had guys tell me that you can't use these full-sized wheels on a mini lathe, but here I am doing it anyway. The reality is the mini lathe has plenty of power and plenty of speed to use these wheels effectively. And now I've got about 15 minutes invested in the outside of this piece. I'm on the 3rd wheel and we're just about done. The last step of this buffing, it just applies a very thin coat of carnauba wax. The wax is meant more to protect the piece than to shine it up. The piece is already shiny before we put it on. And there you can see a nice perfect finish. No runs, no fusses. And once you start doing it, it's kind of hard to stop buffing things. So, you think the wife will use my nice wooden yarn bowl or that ceramic thing? She better use the wooden one.